Hello, book bellas and fellas, Kira here, and today I am going to be talking about my favorite reads of fantasy and science fiction that I read in 2018. It has been quite a few weeks since I actually sat in front of a camera. Right after New Year's, I got really sick. I ended up with an upper respiratory infection, and for somebody who has asthma, that doesn't make things very easy at all. So I am much better now. I am not coughing every other word, which is fantastic. And I am just happy to be sitting back in front of the camera again to film some more videos. I was very fortunate. Just before I got sick, I had pre-filmed a few videos. If you guys noticed the last few weeks, I have only been putting out one video. If I hadn't have had those pre-filmed, I probably would not have been able to put out anything. So I'm very grateful that I happen to have a couple videos that I had pre-filmed in order to make sure that I had stuff for you guys to watch on my channel. So I am very excited to get into my favorite books of 2018 and get back to filming on a regular schedule again for the year of 2019, but let's go ahead and get into the books that I really liked during 2018 for fantasy and science fiction. Now, I didn't put these into any particular order. I kind of just picked them based on how I felt about them overall, because I read 132 books in 2018, which is quite a few books to narrow it down to, but I managed to do it. I'm also going to be doing a separate video for the contemporary books that I really enjoyed, and I hope you guys enjoy them. So let's just go ahead and get on into the books. So one of the books that I read towards the beginning of the year is Thunderhead. This is a sequel to Scythe by Neal Shusterman. This is a science fiction, fantasy, dystopian, and I absolutely love this series so much. I thought I fell in love with it the first time around when I read Scythe. Well, this is the sequel to Scythe, and after I read Thunderhead, there was all these new dimensions to love. It just added so much depth and additional viewpoints that I hadn't gotten from the first book. One of the reasons why I love reading series so much is because it gives the author more time to elaborate on the world that he is building. So this really did that for me. This is a dystopian society where nobody dies. They have mastered death. They have mastered aging. They call it turning a corner when you decide to reset your clock back to being like 20-something years old, like when you're older, and nobody dies anymore. So in order to maintain a balance, they have to have these people called scythes that go around and randomly pick people to kill in order to maintain population control. So in this society, people are still having babies and the world's still supporting all of this, even with there not being a ton of deaths. So this is a very complex world. It's very well fleshed out. I am dying to get my hands on the third one, but they still have not released, as of today, anything about when that one's going to be released. All we know is it might be released in 2019, and I am stoked. Like, I cannot wait for that. It's going to be awesome. If you like science fiction fantasies, this is just amazing, and I absolutely love it. It's just, this was one of my most anticipated releases of 2018. It did not disappoint, and I just adore this book so much. Read the first one, read the second one, because they will be so amazing for you. And I love the fact that this author didn't just take this with a grain of salt. He really added depth to these characters. He added life to them. And so I cannot express to you enough how much I absolutely love this series. The next book that I read towards the beginning of the year is Red Rising by Pierce Brown. This has been getting a lot of buzz in the book community, and I absolutely loved this book. This is another science fiction dystopian style book, and it is actually geared towards adults, and I was on the edge of my seat the entire time I was reading this book. It blew my mind. Like, I love the little twists, the little turns, and it was like non-stop, heart-pumping action all the way through it. This is all about our main character, Darrow, who lives underground on the planet of Mars. So the people who run this mine, because he mines for nutrients down in the mines in Mars, and he actually does drilling, and like, it takes a special kind of person to be able to drill. So they drill into Mars like to get nutrients and things that they need in order to survive in their culture. They have been told almost repeatedly that there is nothing above the surface. They are Reds, they are the lowest class, and they are enslaved to everything else that exists on Mars. This Darrow is this very talented driller who works in the mines, and he has this beautiful wife, and while life is really hard on him, the fact that he has his wife gets him through. Well, something happens and things kind of just fall apart on him. And the way he rises to it, the way he seeks revenge, the way he decides to go about doing everything having to do with this is just freaking phenomenal. And I was blown away. Like, I know everybody has said that this is one of those books that is, just really popular, but the hype is real for this. And if you like science fiction dystopians, this is such a great read. It's just, I loved this book so much. It was just something so different than anything I've ever read before as far as all the dystopian. And not to mention, let's just go ahead and mention the politics for a second and like all the war strategies that they have throughout this. I was blown away about how much I felt like I was a part of every little piece of action that was going on. And it just floored me that I got so deep into this. I felt like I was right there alongside the characters, just fighting it out, and my heart would not stop racing. And it was just like, the second I finished one chapter, I had to go on to the next one just to find out what was happening. Phenomenal. So good. So good. Another book that I read is Mem. This is also a science fiction book. Here, I'll go ahead and put this a little bit closer because the light is trying to blur everything out because it is bright. And this kind of takes place in an alternate history, like at the turn of the century, like around 1800s. And it consists of this technology where people go through and they decide to export a bad memory that they have into these things called extracts. So if the person's name is Dolores, for example, like their main character, they would extract like their very first memory into something called Dolores Extract number 1. Well, that's exactly what this person did, and you really don't get to meet her a lot. You don't get a really good feel for the person, like where this memory came from. But the point of these people that were created was to house just a single memory that would go over and over and over and over again, and they would not be able to remember or operate with anything else. It's just a way for these people to get rid of bad memories that they've already had. But something happens with Dolores Extract number 1 that really makes her stand out. She doesn't just remember that one memory, and she doesn't just function off of that one memory, and she actually goes through and she becomes her own person. And what I really loved about this book, what I felt was so amazing, is the fact that it really just kind of dove into what it meant to be human. And I love how it dove into that and how it made me feel like what it meant to be vulnerable and open and have family. And it was just, for being the fact that this is a very small and short book, this was such a beautiful read. There are a few things in this that kind of would have made it confusing, and I heard a lot of people, criticizing this book for this, and I can completely understand why, because it can be kind of confusing. Sometimes her past memories run into her present, which I kind of feel like is this whole stream of consciousness thing that happens when, when our past kind of relates to our future and it blends in together. When we are living on a day-to-day basis, something will happen that will remind us of something in our past, and they kind of blend together at some points. So I do understand that this can be kind of confusing, because sometimes they kind of flip-flop very suddenly between the past and the present. But to me, that made it feel more realistic. So while I do completely respect other people's differences of opinions on this book, I feel like I really bonded with this character because those little imperfections and those little complexities that they added to this book, for me, really made it jump out. And I just absolutely loved how it was written. And it was just such an incredible read. It was so different from a lot of the other things that I've been reading. And I love how they took this person who had one memory and kind of just made her into this very interesting human being and made her feel very, very real. So this was just, oh my God. I love making these favorite videos because I just get so pumped over these. But this is such a wonderful and beautiful and just simplistic, while also being very complex read, and adds so many good quotes and so much beauty to it. And I just love this so much. So this is one of the books that I recommend. It is by Bethany Morrow, and I just absolutely love this book so much. It's short and it's so sweet. Another book that I read towards the beginning of the year is Everyone's an Alien When You're an Alien Too, and it's by Jimmy Sun. This is a very, very short, very sweet little book. It didn't take me very long to read at all. It was like a couple of hours, but this is a book that packs a really, really hard punch. I was very impressed with how much this dove into things, and it was just such a beautiful read. I actually originally read it on my Kindle, and then I loved it so much I ended up having to hunt down a hard copy, because while it is not super complex, it does have a lot of these really deep feelings, and it's all about this little alien that goes through these animals to learn how to be human, because he figures that the animals are humans, and he has no idea like that he's not really interacting with humans. He's just interacting with life forms on the planet, and he actually learns like what it means to be human, and it has all of these deep messages about it. And I really love those books that really dive in to what it means to be human, and life and death and everything else, because it just adds this whole new dimension into how you see the world. And so I loved this book so much, and it was just such a beautiful little book, and it was so quick. So wonderful. So the next book I kind of binge read. This was a series that I binge read towards the beginning of the year before I started my BookTube channel. A lot of these books that I've already mentioned I read before I started my BookTube channel, because I actually didn't start it until August of 2018, and so these are a lot of books like that I never got a chance to talk about because of the fact I had not yet had my BookTube channel. So the next book that I want to discuss is A Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness. I was really anticipating knowing that they were coming out with The Times Convert, and so I really was very anxious to get to these, because my parents had given me these, not this past Christmas, but the Christmas before last, in the trilogy, and I was very, very excited to be getting to these as well. This has got a kind of Romeo and Juliet vibe, but with witches and vampires, because it's forbidden for witches and vampires to get together, and it's not okay because they don't want the bloodlines mixing between, like them having babies and everything. So there's something very blasphemous, and there's a council that tries to make sure that none of this happens. So you have Matthew, who is the vampire, and Diana Bishop, who is a witch, but she doesn't want to be a witch. She doesn't want that power. She doesn't want that responsibility, and she doesn't want to be this, kind of phenomenon as far as a witch goes. But apparently she has a lot of budding power that she has no idea what to do with. So Diana is actually a historian. She's working on her doctorate degree at Oxford. In Diana's studies, she is actually studying alchemy, and she comes across this ashmole book, this very rare ashmole book that Matthew has been hunting for 4 years. And when she opens it, this pulse kind of gets sent out, and she gets really panicked by it, because once again, she's not trying to get into her witchcraft, and she puts it back into the vault for this historic library. And so Matthew and a lot of the surrounding supernatural beings feel it, and he decides to go and investigate. In the process, he ends up getting really connected to Diana, and Be Still My Beating Heart, I loved it so much, because there wasn't a ton of angst. There was a little bit, but it was that whole forbidden thing that really got me, and I just was like, oh yes. It was just so good. So I really flew. I mean, this is a pretty good sized book, but I flew through it really quickly. I had no problem flying through it really quickly. And honestly, after reading the trilogy, I have to honestly say that this was definitely by far and above my favorite of the trilogy, which is not something like that typically happens in trilogies. Usually the first one's your least favorite, but this one was my favorite out of all 3 of the books. And that's why I decided to pick this one. But it was such a great fantasy, and it had a lot of history to it that was very interesting, and a lot of biology, and it just integrated a lot of things that you would not normally expect to see in something like this. And so I really had a lot of respect and love for this book, because it was just so different, and it was just so wonderful, and the romance was just so heart-catching. It was just great. Seriously, read it. If you haven't read it, you should totally read it. I have mentioned this book a couple times because, I just can't get over how much I really loved this book. And apparently I was into a lot of books with a little bit of romance this year, which big surprise, because I'm kind of a sucker for romance, and all that stuff that makes your heart skip a beat and everything, and it's just a lovely distraction, of course. So the next book that I had to put on here, because even months after reading this, I still cannot get this out of my mind. It just burns there, and it's just wow. So That book is A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J. Maas. This is the second book in the series. This is my favorite book in the trilogy that they have thus far. They are adding on to it, but I just... Feyre and Rhysand. Feyre and Rhysand. I cannot say how much I love that couple and ship that couple, and actually like... it was pure beauty. And not to mention like the storyline, that everything that was surrounding this was just wonderful. The first book in this series is very much a Beauty and the Beast retelling with fairies, and it had that much of a vibe. But then this book, they really branched out from that. I didn't think I was going to love another book as much as I loved the first one. And then I got to this book, and then that totally changed. And it's like, how could I have ever loved any other book in that series more than I loved this book? And this was like such a crowning achievement in that series, and it was just so great, and I totally ship this couple. And I don't want to say too much about this book in general because it is a sequel, and for those of you who have not read the first book, I don't want to ruin anything for you. I just know that I was hooked on the first book, and I was even more hooked on this book, and it was just amazing. So the next book that I have to talk about is actually a graphic novel, and it was beautiful, and it was another science fiction fantasy style graphic novel, and it was good. So it was Descender, and by Jeff Lemire and Dustin Guyon. I think there's, hold on. Okay, that's 4 authors. That's the last name. And this is a graphic novel, and I like how it was kind of like watercolored and gritty and messy and everything, and it's just very interesting. Many years before, Tim 21 was brought to this mining planet to be a companion for this little boy. And the mother bought Tim 21 to be like a brother to him so that he would have somebody to play with, he would have social interaction, with friendship. Well, one day, one big happy family, she's at the mine, and she's kind of higher ranking in the mines, and this giant robot shows up. And it shows up on a lot of these major planets, and just they have to flee, and Tim 21 goes into kind of a sleeping mode. And so he doesn't wake up for like, I think it is like maybe 10 or 12 years, somewhere around there. And so after he wakes up, he realizes that these robots, like these giant godlike robots, have destroyed so much of these planets and killed so many people. And he wakes up to this planet being deserted, so he sends out a distress call only to find that he's getting hunted by other bounty hunters because there's a price on his head. Tim 21 has this coating inside of him, this coating that is very similar to these godlike robots. He's very sought after because they want to understand these godlike robots and figure out how to defeat them in the future should they ever attack again. This kind of goes into like him getting rescued and then like him going to another planet. There is a lot of other things in this that make it just a wonderful book. And as far as like graphic novels go and comics and all that, this is a great science fiction book, and it's very interesting. And I really enjoyed how gritty it was because it made it feel lived in, and it was an amazing story, and definitely one of my favorites from the year as far as graphic novels are concerned. It was just great. It's very much science fiction, but I loved it. So I read a ton of Brandon Sanderson this year. I mean, a ton. And I could not have gotten through this entire favorites video without mentioning something that had to do with Brandon Sanderson. So earlier this year, I actually read my very first Brandon Sanderson novel, which sent me down the rabbit hole of reading pretty much everything else that I could get my hands on by him, because Brandon Sanderson does give all the feels. The first book that I ever read by him was Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. This is the UK paperback edition. It is, not only is it gorgeous, which makes me just love it all the more, but the story is also very intriguing. This was the very first book that he ever had published. I was trying to read a lot of his other stuff before I got to Mistborn, which I am currently in the middle of, by the way, when you guys will be hearing about that later on, because I am glowing. I just finished the second book. So we will talk about that later. Off topic. Okay, this is pretty much about this capital of Arleon, which has another neighboring kingdom called Elantris, which is completely boxed in because they have this disease called the Shroud, and people wake up and they die, and then they kind of come back to life with the Shroud, and they are very bald and their skin changes. And so a lot of these people, instead of killing them, get sent to Elantris to live out the rest of their lives. Well, another interesting thing is that these people don't need to eat, but there is a ton of political intrigue in this. And I know this isn't everybody's favorite Brandon Sanderson book because, especially if you read a lot of his other stuff, there's a lot of other great things about his book, but this was the very first book that I ever read by him. And so it just absolutely amazed me how much I enjoyed reading this book. And one of the reasons that this also makes this my favorite book of the year is because it was my gateway to reading a ton of other things that Brandon Sanderson wrote that I absolutely loved. This is actually an adult fantasy, but I loved it also because it wasn't quite written for an adult fantasy. It was written for anybody that is trying to get into adult fantasy, that is bridging from YA, a fantasy, to adult fantasy. It's very clean. It's got a lot of things that don't make it super complex, but it definitely has a lot of politics in it. I loved this book so much, and it left such a lasting impression. I'm so glad I got introduced to it. So the next book that I have to discuss is Brandon Sanderson's Skyward. This was another book that I read towards the end of the year, and it is another science fiction, but this is one of his YA science fiction books, and it is all about this girl named Spensa who has to live in her father's legacy. They live on another planet that is not Earth, but a lot of the Earth people live there, and they have to live below ground because every time they come above ground, they get attacked from above by aliens. And so being a fighter pilot and fighting these aliens is a big honor. This is how they protect themselves. Well, Spence's dad was a fighter pilot, and he completely ended up going through and he ended up betraying them, and he ended up turning on his crewmates. And so ever since then, she's had to live in her father's legacy, and she has been fighting to become a pilot just like him, but they look at her like she has the same problem that her father did, and that she's going to betray everyone just like he did. And so she's having to fight that legacy, but she fights to get into flight school, and she fights to keep it because they keep trying to push her out. I loved this so much. This was such an amazing book. Brandon Sanderson, the more he writes, just keeps getting better and better. And this is the most recent book that he came out with. So I'm going from the very first book that I read by him to this one. And I love watching the evolution of his writing, which is why I kind of wanted to begin at the beginning, where first book he ever got published. And this was so good. And oh man, I just can't wait for the sequel because this is the first in a series and I'm just so excited, but this was awesome. So this is the last book that I have to discuss. I read this towards the end of the year. This is A Chantress from the Stars by Sylvia Eggendahl, and this was actually written in the 1970s. But for what it was very timeless, and I really enjoyed reading it. So Elena is from this very ancient culture, where they don't have any starving anymore or anything, and they use actually technology to do cytokinesis and telekinesis so that they are able to communicate with other members of their crew. They are also anthropologists to go to different planets to help preserve those cultures and allow them to develop naturally the way that they were allowed to develop, so that one day maybe these cultures can be where they're at. And they kind of feel like it's a service and a big responsibility. They go to this planet called Andrisha to help these Andrishans from being invaded by these Imperials. These Imperials have decided that they need more space to grow and they need more resources, so they decide to go in and start building a colony on their planet. Well, it's really interfering with the Andrishans. The Andrishans are having to fight being invaded, and the Imperials want to put them in little small areas and be able to take over the planet. What I really loved about this book is because Elena's culture is so advanced, when you read it from her perspective, it's a science fiction. Gorian, who is the Eldrishan native that we get to interact with, he is actually considered a youngling, a primitive person in comparison. And so when you read it from his perspective, when he's viewing everything that the Imperials have and that Elena is, he's actually viewing it from a fantasy perspective. This is the perfect blend of fantasy and science fiction, which is why I'm ending with this book, because it just brought everything together so perfectly. And I was amazed how it changed how I viewed fantasy and how I viewed science fiction. And the fact that it was written in the 1970s and it still felt so timeless was just absolutely incredible, and I could not rave about this book more because it was just so different. It wasn't one of those books that I couldn't put down, because I was able to put it down, but honestly I just couldn't get it out of my mind, and it was just so different from anything that I read, which is pretty much the going theme of pretty much everything that I've talked about. Was just it's just so different. And I love having my mind expanded and being able to get into different worlds that just bring about this whole new point of view. Well, guys, I thank you so much for joining me. That was my top 10 science fiction and fantasy of 2018. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed this video, hit the little like, hit subscribe, and hit the little bell icon so you will never miss a video. I'm also on Twitter, Instagram, Amazon, and Goodreads. And if you guys are interested in joining me for any of those other social medias, I have all the links linked down in the description below and also on my main page on my channel. Thank you guys so much for joining me. I hope you liked this video, and I will see you guys again very soon.